Welcome everybody to this session of the workshop in the history of material texts. I'm Jerry Singerman, a humanities editor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the organizers of the workshop, along with Zach Lesser, who is the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and Zach, John Pollack, the curator for research services at the Kislak Center for the Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts in the Van Pelt Library, which is where those of us who are physically present are sitting right now. And then Eileen Malcolm, who is our Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, and the person from whom you get your emails and the one who really keeps us organized and moving forward from week to week. Last and certainly not least, Peter Stallybrass, our founding director, the person who set this workshop in motion sometime in the last century, and we've been going ever since. So welcome, Peter. It's wonderful you're here. There is an attendance sheet being passed around for those of you who are present. So everybody please sign, both because we want to know that you're here, but also it is a COVID era requirement so that we have tracing information. If anybody is here who is not on the listserv, also just be sure to put your email address and a note that you'd like to be added to the listserv. And for all of you who are Zooming in, we do want you to be as actively present as possible. So Eileen will be curating the chat during the presentation, and she'll flag any questions that are posed through the chat, but I encourage you all to use the raise hand function in your Zoom during the discussion so that we can recognize you and call upon you and pose your questions in person. So please do that. Well, Marcy Dinius is no stranger to many of us, but it is a huge and I'd say overdue pleasure to welcome her back in person to Penn. She has, I'll note, in her physical absence, been a frequent and steady visitor to this workshop via Zoom, for which we're very grateful. So many of us first met Marcy back in 2005, 2006, when after taking her doctorate at Northwestern, she had a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the Penn Humanities Forum during the year dedicated to the topic of word and image under the direction of none other than Peter Stallybrass. We were pleased not to have to bid her farewell at the end of that year, as she took up an assistant professorship of English at our near neighbor, the University of Delaware, and she remained our even nearer neighbor by remaining and living here in Philadelphia. In 2011, Marcy left Delaware for DePaul University in Chicago, where she's currently associate professor of English and also the founder and I guess current vice president of that university's AAUP chapter. Meanwhile, her ties to Philadelphia and Penn have remained strong, with a fellowship at the Library Company in 2012 and through her role from 2010 to 2016 as a faculty participant in the Library Company and the McNeil Center's annual summer dissertation seminars in early American literature and material texts, which is a program that she directed in 2014. Marcy has been the recipient of fellowships from the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Newberry Library, and the Fulbright Foundation, which will carry her to Japan in a few weeks for the next 6 months. Her writings have appeared in PMLA, J19, Early American Studies, ESQ, and Post Studies, among other venues, as well as in volumes published by Cambridge, Michigan, Minnesota. In 2018, she co-edited with Sonia Hazard the special issue of Early American Studies devoted to keywords in early American literature and material texts. My own professional engagement with Marcy began with the publication of her first Penn book, The Camera and the Press, American Visual and Print Culture in the Age of the Daguerreotype, which appeared in the Material Text series in 2012. It's a work that Lisa Gittleman has deemed, quote, instrumental in refiguring American society and culture of the 19th century, and that was praised in the TLS as a quote, consummate feat of scholarship and descriptive prose. Our collaboration extended quite happily for me to her second pen book, The Textual Effects of David Walker's Appeal, Print-Based Activism in Antebellum America, which is scheduled to appear later this spring. In that book, which is the jumping off point for this evening's presentation, Marcy really forces us to reconsider what a book might look like, what authorship might be, and not the least, what agency a printed text might have in affecting political change. So please do join me in welcoming Marcy Dinius, who will speak to us on the topic of David Walker's textual engagements.
Right. Thank you so much, Jerry, for such a gracious introduction. I'm so glad I'm wearing a mask because I'm genuinely feeling a little bit weepy. It is a true pleasure to be back here at Penn with so many, oh boy, I am going to get emotional, dear friends in the room and dear friends online. So a little kind of roadmap for this evening. I'm going to start with my formal talk, which has, for those of us who have the misfortune in the room of not being Americanists, a bit of a contextual setting of David Walker's Appeal, and a very brief lit review, and then go into the formal talk, and then we'll have the Q&A, and then afterwards, unfortunately for the Zoom participants will miss this. We have a little bit of a show and tell that takes us beyond the talk and a little bit more into my forthcoming book project and hopefully where I'm headed next. So here we go with, let's see, sharing screen and then PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, a 76 to 88 page pamphlet self-published by Walker in 3 editions in Boston between 1829 and 1830, was one of the most influential texts published in 19th century America for its rigorously reasoned and deeply felt arguments against US racial slavery and anti-Blackness, and especially for its justifications of enslaved people's right to defend themselves and their families against tyrannous slaveholders. It motivated some of the strictest anti-literacy laws, strictest laws against Black literacy and mobility in the South during the slavery era. It also inspired William Lloyd Garrison to begin publishing The Liberator in Boston in 1831, as well as the American Anti-Slavery Society's print-centered strategy, political strategy in its 1835 Great Postal Campaign, which circulated hundreds of thousands of anti-slavery pamphlets throughout the South. And here's an unwelcome reception of those pamphlets, a depiction of them. All of these publications issuing from the North, anti-slavery publications, occasioned vigorous Southern legal and extra-legal suppression of all anti-slavery print issuing from the North. Recent research has revealed that Walker's recent research has revealed the appeal's hemispheric reach into Brazil in the mid-1830s, where it was invoked in print debates about race, citizenship, and Brazil's constitutional monarchy. For most of the 20th century, historians and literature scholars mostly understood Walker's pamphlet primarily in relation to the Nat Turner-led resistance in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, suggesting that it inspired the uprising, and also as a founding text in the intellectual and political histories of Black nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Peter Hinks's 1997 monograph, To Awaken My Afflicted Brethren, David Walker and the Problem of Antebellum Slave Resistance, offered the first and the still valuable in-depth historical analysis of Walker and his appeal. Elizabeth McHenry's path-breaking 2002 book, Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African-American Literary Societies, begins with Walker's Appeal in a sensitive, close, and contextual reading that positions it as emblematic of how print served as a crucial, quote, medium through which a sense of Black solidarity was both communicated and achieved. More recently, the appeal figures as a key text in Cheryl Wall's important attention to the neglected genre of the essay in African-American literary history in her 2018 book on Freedom and the Will to Adorn. In the textual effects of David Walker's appeal, I offer a new analysis of Walker's appeal and its direct influence on 5 politically and textually radical pamphlets that African-American and Native American writers wrote and published in the United States between 1831 and 1851. I examine how African-American activists and writers activists and writers Mariah W. Stewart, William Paul Quinn, Henry Highland Garnett, and Paola Brown, and Native American activist writer William Apis all answered Walker's appeal by taking up print as a powerful weapon against racism and slavery on Walker's model. And here you can see their title pages, or at least reproductions of them. And we're fortunate enough tonight, at least those of us who are here in the room, to be able to look at a few examples of Apis's other publications. And many thanks to John for pulling those. These activist writers produce pamphlets that challenge traditional relationships between the form and content of printed texts. The romantic idea of authorship as individualistic and entirely original, literacy as limited to the reading and writing of written language, and literature as strictly belletristic. Rather than being side effects of their pamphlets, it aims to affect meaningful social change, specifically the realization of the full equality promised by the principles of the American Revolution. Walker's, Stewart's, Quinn's, Apis's, Garnett's, and Brown's contributions to the developing print cultures of the United States and Canada are integral with their efforts to transform political and social culture nationally and internationally. This evening, or late afternoon, or wherever we are in time, I'll share the part of my book in which I've started to consider how Walker was not only influential, but also was influenced himself. Specifically, what follows focuses on Lindley Murray's English grammar as a more integral text to Walker's appeal in his strategies for reaching different kinds of readers than we've recognized to this point. Let's stay there. Murray first published his grammar in England in 1795 as part of the Grand Enlightenment project to organize, regularize, and understand everything. And Walker specifically invokes it several times in his text. I'll spend the next 15 minutes or so taking us through how Walker both adopted and critically adapted the culturally and personally influential examples of late 18th century epistemology and the philosophies of language, rhetoric, and pedagogy that he found in Murray's grammar to suit his and all African Americans' ends. I argue that by doing so, Walker not only extended, but also significantly transformed Enlightenment age philosophical inquiry, pedagogy, speaking, and writing in ways that made sure that these powerful modes of thinking, learning, and communicating were both available to and further transformable by all people of African descent. To the third and last edition of his appeal, Walker added these two important paragraphs on the verso of his title page, where we'd of course find a copyright notice for publications that have been registered for copyright. And in my book, I argued that this is a deliberate placement and a deliberate non-registration for copyright by Walker because he prioritized circulation over ownership. Here, Walker reaffirms his primary audience, who are the colored citizens of the world, and multiply asserts his appeal's primary claims. And those are that the, quote, colored people of these United States are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived, end quote. And that the racial slavery practiced by so-called Christian Americans is responsible for this unprecedented wretchedness. In Murray's English grammar, adapted to different classes of learners, and that's the full version of Murray's title, or fuller version, Walker found an important and useful strategy for organizing his text for his different readers, and a model for explaining this organization to them so that they would know how to make best use of his political and pedagogical text. In Article 2 of Walker's appeal, which he dedicates to exploring our wretchedness in consequence of ignorance, he specifically notes that he has, quote, examined schoolboys and young men of color in different parts of the country in the most simple parts of Murray's English grammar, end quote. He's done so, he explains, to assess the level and quality of their educations. His most educated Black and white readers equally and immediately would have understood why Walker was invoking this textbook as authoritative in relation to his inquiries. As Charles and E. Jennifer Monahan explain of Murray's grammar and his 1799 English reader, and this is the Monahan, Murray's works gained instant acceptance in the New Republic, and his works were reprinted by printers all over America, becoming steady sellers for 4 decades, surpassing even Noah Webster's totals. Murray sold 16 million copies of his works in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, thereby becoming the largest selling author in the world. Among these many reprintings, this 1825 edition of the grammar, printed by Thomas Bedlington in Boston that you see on screen, whether you're on Zoom or here in the room, would have been readily available to Walker while he was first writing his appeal in 1829. And I don't think we have a copy of Walker's, or I'm sorry, of Murray's grammar.
Because John forgot to get it.
Because John, no apologies, that's okay. We've still got time. I think there's an 1826 one that I'd ask for. Both of these editions, the 1825 on screen and the 1826 that we have here, both include Murray's original introduction to the text that explains his textual strategies for reaching his different classes of learners, as well as his philosophies of language, thought, and understanding that undergird the grammar. In explaining the latter, Murray declares most basically, quote, "Words are the sign of our ideas, and the medium by which we perceive the sentiments of others and communicate our own. Because language is therefore the means, quote, with which we transfuse our sentiments into the mind of one another, what Murray calls a competent knowledge of words and their relation to each other and ideas is essential. Without this competent knowledge, Murray cautions, quote, we shall be frequently in hazard of misunderstanding others and being misunderstood ourselves. This hazard of misunderstanding is not only person to person, but ultimately social and with great consequences. Murray underscores, quote, many of the differences in opinion among men, with the disputes, contentions, and alienations of the heart, which have too often proceeded from such differences, result from want of proper skill in the connection and meanings of words and a tenacious misapplication of language. Murray raises the stakes of this branch of learning even higher by invoking fellow 18th century Scottish rhetorician and philosopher Hugh Blair, Mrs. Blair. All that regards the study of composition merits the highest attention upon this account, that it is intimately connected with the improvement of our intellectual powers. For I must be allowed to say that when we are employed after a proper manner in the study of composition, we are cultivating the understanding itself. That Walker took these lessons from Murray's introduction to heart is apparent throughout his appeal, and especially so in Article 2, which again focuses on the importance of education for all African Americans. There, he specifically instructs his free and more liberally educated Black readers, quote, let the aim of your labors among your brethren, and particularly the youths, be the dissemination of education and religion. He also emphasizes to both his liberally and partially educated free Black readers that reading, quote, well, as trifling as it may appear to some, to the ignorant in particular, is a great part of learning, end quote. And he distinguishes this more advanced form of literacy from what he calls merely scribbling tolerably well. And he makes that distinction repeatedly. He closes the second article by citing an 8-year-old African-American boy from his home state of Massachusetts who testifies that the local school committee has strictly limited instruction in grammar to white students only. As these passages begin to suggest, Walker, like Murray and Blair, considered the in-depth study of grammar, which Murray breaks down as words, syntax, pronunciation, punctuation, and perspicuity and accuracy in spoken and written communication, as essential to the full development of all human minds and to understanding between all human beings. For Walker and African Americans, the stakes could not be higher. And this is Walker. There is a great work for you to do, as trifling as some of you may think it. You have to prove to the Americans and the world that we are men, not brutes, as we have been represented and by millions treated. And here he specifically has in mind one American from making such influential claims, and that's Thomas Jefferson, whose notes on the state of Virginia we'll be able to look at here in the room. I read Walker's emphasis here on the importance of studying grammar and Murray's and Blair's messages about its centrality to cultivating human and self and inter-understanding as an invitation to linger on Murray's introduction in his grammar. By doing so, we can see how Walker also took to heart Murray's lessons about how to structure a complicated text on a highly complex subject. In Walker's case, US racial slavery and discrimination, so that it would be both legible and useful in different ways to people with very different degrees of education. In the second paragraph of his introduction, Murray notes, In books designed for the instruction of youth, there is a medium to be observed between treating the subject in so extensive and minute a manner as to embarrass and confuse their minds by offering too much at once for their comprehension, and on the other hand, by conducting it by such short and general precepts and observations as to convey to them no clear and precise information. This is the delicate balance that the paper writer tries to strike too, right? Walker recognized his need to strike such a balance as well in presenting the historical development and many depredations of US racial slavery. He acknowledges the complexity of this subject explicitly in his preamble. Quote, "The causes, my brethren, which produce our wretchedness and miseries are so very numerous and aggravating that I believe the pen only of a Josephus or a Plutarch can well enumerate and explain them." Murray offers the following strategy for addressing the numerous and aggravating complexities of English grammar. Quote, a distinct general view or outline of all the essential parts of the study in which they are engaged, a gradual and judicious supply of this outline, and a due arrangement of the divisions according to their natural order and connection, appear to be among the best means of enlightening the minds of youth and of facilitating their acquisition of knowledge. In Walker's preamble, he similarly explains how he has ordered his appeal using this divide and conquer approach. And this is Walker. "The sources from which our miseries are derived and on which I shall comment, I shall not combine in one, but shall put them under distinct heads and expose them in their turn." The sources of misery that Walker selects, which are slavery, enforced ignorance, Christianity's perversion in service of slavery, and colonization, are the subjects of the 4 chapters that follow his preface. By specifically titling his preface a preamble and the 4 subsequent chapters as Roman-numbered articles, Walker also reconstitutes the US Constitution into a foundational text in the history and grammar of anti-slavery and anti-racism. Yet his appeal's piecemeal treatment of these subjects, and thereby his reconstitution of the Constitution, does not come at the cost of underrepresenting the ultimate horror and irrationality of race-based slavery. Walker forewarns his readers in the preamble, which, and I love this, he also refers to them, the preamble, as his remarks on the suburbs, that when he enters, quote, more fully into the interior of the system of cruelty and oppression, end quote, the main causes of Black Americans' miseries that he presents in each article will be seen to, quote, rage to such an alarming pitch that they cannot but be a perpetual source of terror and dismay to every reflecting mind. In that English grammar was likely more difficult than perpetually terrifying and dismaying for most of the students that Murray had in mind, he includes no such warning about his lessons rising to an alarming pitch. But Murray did recognize that in seeking to establish a middle ground between overwhelming complexity and overly reductive simplicity with his grammar, that middle would necessarily be different for readers at different levels in their educations. Accordingly, Murray explains the textual strategies that he devised for reaching these different classes of readers where they are. Interestingly, typography is central to these strategies. And this is Murray. "The more important rules, definitions, and observations, and which are therefore the most proper to be committed to memory, are printed with larger type, whilst rules and remarks that are of less consequence and that extend or diversify the general idea, or that serve as explanations, are contained in the smaller letter." Murray advises beginning students to focus on the lessons printed in the larger type and to postpone the finer points that he puts on them that are set apart in smaller type till the general system be completed. And hopefully you can kind of make it out. The type sizes aren't quite that different here, but at the very beginning, the first 2 paragraphs are a slightly bigger typeface than under point 2, where we get more explanation of what a substantive is, right? And to adults who may be assisting younger learners in their lessons, either as parent teachers or to classroom teachers, Murray explains that he has included, quote, notes and observations in the common and detached manner at the bottom of the page, that is, footnotes. In adopting these textual strategies, Murray notes that care has been taken to adjust the text so that the whole may be perused in a connected progress, or the part contained in the larger character read in order by itself. That is, some readers may be best served by reading only parts of the grammar initially and then returning to read it and learn more each time, and others by reading the whole of it. Either way, readers will learn the same major lessons, with the most advanced readers learning them in greater detail. Walker takes unusual advantage of typography in footnotes to add emphasis to messages that he especially wants to foreground in his appeal, and you get just a small taste of that here in these snippets. I've analyzed this typography much more closely in this PMLA article from a while ago now. But despite such typographic manipulations, Walker does not follow Murray's model of presenting his main points for his least literate audience and/or most hurried audience members in larger type, and his subsequent elaborations of these points in smaller type. Instead, Walker places the main lessons that he wants all of his readers to take away at the start of all but one of the text's 5 sections. And you can kind of get a sense of that here. The very first paragraph of, I believe, all but the preamble at the beginning of each article highlight what the main point of the whole article is, and then the rest, everything that follows, is much more detailed. In that his lengthy elaborations of his 4 articles' topics constitute the majority of the text of the appeal, we can understand why Walker might have departed from Murray's model by choosing not to set most of the text in smaller type. That would have made for the majority of the text much harder to read. Scholarly readers who have been most attentive to Walker's strategies for addressing different audiences do not seem to have discerned a pattern in how Walker organized his text beyond its structure of a preamble in 4 articles. But perhaps some of his 19th century readers might have been quicker to isolate how he placed his main points at or very near the beginning of each article, and they may well have abridged the text accordingly, either to suit their own more limited reading abilities and time, or to abridge it for reading aloud for easier or more hurried consumption by others under circumstances of duress that we can certainly imagine. Even if so, Walker suggests that his text doesn't really need abridging for any readers. He concludes his appeal by submitting it to his, quote, brethren in language so very simple that the most ignorant, who can read it all, may easily understand, of which you may make the best of it you possibly can. In this closing statement of his pamphlet's legibility and his expectation of all its readers, I want to suggest again that we should recognize the influence of Murray's English grammar and the Enlightenment commitment to disciplined philosophical inquiry and mutual understanding that it pedagogically exemplifies. Like Murray, Walker offered his book to readers at all levels of literacy, with the expectation that they would read it intensively, progressing in their educations with each reading. While expecting such intensive engagement from enslaved readers might seem especially idealistic, if not impossible, given the strict controls on literacy, time, possessions, contact, mobility, and all other aspects of life in slavery, Walker was fully aware of these serious challenges to his aims for his pamphlet and its enslaved readers. At several points in the 3rd and last edition of his appeal, he includes discussions, explicit discussions, of how white Southerners legally prescribed instruction in literacy to enslaved people and how they violently punished enslaved people for trying to read or just possessing printed materials, including his own appeal. By then, it was already circulating and being confiscated. And while we might be tempted to contradict his claim that the appeal's language is quite so very simple, much of it actually is. And a good deal of it is no more challenging than the most basic aspects of Murray's English grammar. Recognizing this, I understand Walker is unwilling to concede to slavery that his appeal would go unreceived, unread, and not understood by enslaved people, and is equally unwilling to expect anything less of any of his African American readers than white Americans and Europeans expected of their own children. That is to say, Walker wrote his appeal with both the high-mindedness of an Enlightenment philosophe and even tougher love than the sternest pedagogues who used Murray's grammar, setting the highest possible expectations for reading and learning, not because he expected all of his readers to meet them immediately, but because he wanted them to know that he was certain that all of them could meet them in time, through dedicated study, and with the right teachers, texts, and social and legal circumstances for learning. Unfortunately and understandably, we have little evidence, hard evidence that we have little hard evidence that Walker's text realized his aims among readers who were enslaved. Thus, the temptation to make the speculative cause and effect connection between the appeal and the resistance associated with Nat Turner. But the September 28, 1830 issue of the Boston Daily Evening Transcript contains one important record of the effects on the African-American citizens of Walker's Boston. And I'm grateful to Elizabeth McHenry for featuring this in her work. And this is from the Daily Evening Transcript. Since the publication of that flagitious pamphlet, Walker's Appeal, we have noticed a marked difference in the deportment of our colored population. It is evident that they have read this pamphlet. We know that the larger portion of them have read it or heard it read, and that they glory in its principles as if it were a star in the east, guiding them to freedom and emancipation. With this account, we get a glimpse of how some within Walker's literate and less literate Northern African-American audiences understood, discursively, emotionally, and bodily, his appeal and how it moved them. In the same account, we can also see how it did so in ways that were visible to white Americans, who clearly understood, either sympathetically or anxiously, that a racial hierarchy based on slavery and racism could be usurped, perhaps even by a Walker-inspired, Black-led Second American Revolution that finally realized the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality for all Americans. And so that concludes the formal part of my talk, and I'd be happy to stop sharing the screen here. And wait, where's the escape button? Here we go. Now wait, new share. Stop share. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for the help navigating. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Marcy. And now the floor is open for questions, and surprisingly, Liliana has her hand raised.
Thank you so much, Marcy. What a wonderful presentation. The way you put it or presented it, it's very, very persuasive. The typography and the way it is on the page is giving a pedagogical impact, but also a guidance of how to read them. I'm thinking, however, at the very same time, Edgar Allan Poe is doing something slightly similar with his journalism and short stories, using the capital letters, the exclamation mark, and so on. But in his case, it was the theory that these stories needed to be read aloud. And so what I'm after is the question between written and oral language, because there is a great paradox. What you presented is a visualization of the text. But interestingly enough, it is also that the musical score to be read aloud. So what is this kind of written language that is really to be spoken?
Yes. No, thank you so much for that question, Liliana. This is, I appreciate it, especially because it takes me all the way back to my earliest days of participating in the material text seminar. I thought about this first with the PMLA article that I published on Walker's Appeal. That was my first attempt to really read it closely and try to reckon with this visually remarkable text, right? On almost every page of it, there are what I read as someone who plays music as dynamic markings, and you can see it. It's the most emotional passages in the appeal, where he clearly is upset himself, but also wants whoever's reading this aloud, either to a group of people, or perhaps reading silently, but feeling from the page, almost hearing from the page his emotions, for them to mirror his emotions. And really, to answer your question about the relationship between print and orality, I have to say I'm indebted to a remark that Peter Stallybrous once made in a material text seminar about reversing our thinking about manuscript as an occasion for print, right? You were speaking about blank forms, I believe, and thinking, reversing it and encouraging us to think about print as an occasion or occasions for manuscript, right? And I was thinking about that same move that these texts, Walker's Appeal is not alone, but it's certainly an unusual and elaborate example of that relationship between print and orality, where, you know, we're so used to thinking about orality being translated into print, right? Like printed sermons, for example, right? But that really Walker is seeing that dynamic going the other way and the need for it to go the other way, and using the occasion of the printedness of his manuscript to occasion performance.
I'm also thinking of the double meaning of giving voice.
Right. Right. Yes, exactly. And of course, in thinking about, you know, voice, giving a voice in the sense of as that sense of advocacy, exactly, precisely, right? That there couldn't be higher stakes for this, and really to my reference to printed sermons as well, that there's so much Walker is drawing on Methodism, especially, and Methodist, you know, the intense affective performative nature of Methodist religious ceremonies in the United States. That's infused in this text too. Yeah, so that intersection as well.
Do you think that is in some way then a point of difference or divergence with Murray? Because I think of the 18th century grammarians really as like on punctuation, for example, really getting rid of kind of orality and attempting to make the language a more purely logical system. When Murray is using typeface, it's really not about orality. It's about his idea of a rational ordering of the text, or thinking about texts that try to strip out what they see as bad commas, which are not logical commas, but are performative commas and things like that. So I wonder if there's a moment where Walker's maybe drawing on and appropriating some of Murray's techniques, but also adapting and transforming.
That's right. And no, that's a wonderful comment, because I originally, when I started thinking about this, I was looking back at the kind of earlier instructions in elocution, right, and the kind of especially elaborate hand gestures, which I'm making not in any kind of educated way, but that that the performative nature of speech that is coming through printed books in that way, and I really do. This represents early work in thinking about these things. I want to think about that transition away from performance into print, and so that these grammars become almost entirely print focused, right? And that you really see the elocutionary aspects of them fall out in some of them, right? And so, and this is where I again need to do more work to make sure I'm accurate on some of these things. But I do see Walker as moving backwards in time in some ways, right? That this is an attempt to really use basically as many forms of communication as possible in a kind of almost all hands on deck moment for the urgency of the political crisis of slavery.
Thanks very, very much, Marcy. It was wonderful. I wanted to pick up on what Liliane was saying and also what Zach was saying. I was thinking along the same lines, and I wondered if we could look again at the detailed images that you had of the sort of blow-ups. There were three little things, those three there. And I was thinking just, very much about just picking up from what Zach was saying, which is that one way, the one track that you're making with Murray is a sort of notion that I would have expected to go just in the way that Zach was saying, which is to go away from this kind of thing, is to actually say we need to get rid of rhetorical punctuation, we need logical punctuation.
Right.
And there could be a kind of interesting tension there between one notion of a kind of common language that everybody will speak. And one of the interesting things that John Barrow's argued that in the 18th century, common language is actually the language of the gentry. It's an elite language, and it doesn't mean what we now mean by it. And so the opposite is jargon. And what jargon means in the 18th century is trade language. So it means what cobblers speak, or so we have actually the reverse of a kind of modern notion that that academics speak jargon and people speak common sense. So it's I mean, and the argument there is going to be this kind of, so this seems to be very much the opposite of this kind of common language. It seems to me excessive, it seems to me highly performative. And it's a question which I have no idea about. Are newspapers doing this kind of thing at all or not?
Not to this degree.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Walker is so exuberant that the printers run out of exclamation points.
Right.
They have to start borrowing.
Right.
Cases.
Right.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of size and things like that. You know, that if you see that all men are created equal.
That's right.
And he keeps repeating this. Was another point, one point where he actually, so are we men?
Yeah.
And then it's sort of small caps. And then I ask you, my brother, are we men?
That's right.
You know, large caps. So it does seem to be extraordinarily performative, this, that the use, and so that the features are exclamation marks, capitalization, italics, which again are, you know, all these things that you're warned against typically today in grammar books. They say don't use too many exclamation marks. There was actually a New Yorker cartoon that said, you know, try to sort of, someone saying to this kid writing there, try to use less than one exclamation mark per word. So this is sort of, anyway, I just really just try to say that if there's one thing that's coming from Murray, it seems to me something going on in a very different direction, which you picked up on before when you talked about typography.
No, I appreciate all of that, Peter. It's in some ways I've foregrounded his allegiance to Murray. I've over-foregrounded it. Where he defies Murray is precisely with respect to Murray's grammar, right? So it's Murray's mode of instruction that Walker follows in defiance of the grammar, basically. And what's so striking about that, especially, is that he's, you know, just throughout the appeal, encouraging education and encouraging especially grammatical education. So it's, you know, do not as I do, basically.
Right.
But again, and it's such a conflicted text in many ways, because he is trying all possible strategies, right? And the urgency of this being communicable to as many different audiences as possible, especially among the enslaved, is his priority. And so he's willing to, again, preach grammar, but not practice it, because in that moment, the performance of it and its oral understanding is most important, the broadest possible transmission of it. And so you get many contradictions throughout the text because of his aims for the text and how he wants it received versus what he's, again, actually preaching in the text often. So that there's, again, if you hold him too closely to his word, you will find him contradicting himself all over the place. But you have to separate out, again, the political urgency of the widest possible circulation from then what he wants actually to happen.
Could I just do a quick follow-up, Jerry, whilst we have this image on the wall, because it's the image there. As I'm recalling the actual Declaration of Independence, when it was first printed, had these rhetorical markers by Thomas and Jefferson, and no one understood what they were. They were taken over from a manuscript version where Jefferson had marked it up for reading, and then it got printed with those manuscript markers. And what strikes me here, whether or not, you know, Walker knew about this, what he's actually doing in the third thing, you say to the world, July the 4th, 1776, he then uses what you could call a version of an emoji. You know, that the emoji is the pointing hand, you know, the fist, that actually, that's what printers call them, fist. So fist, we hold all these truths to be self-evident, that all men, you know, the capitalization created equal. So he's actually doing something that Jefferson had been doing in manuscript. So he, precisely for performance, so he'd read aloud that thing, which the printer had mistaken as being forms of punctuation. So it was actually a misunderstanding, and that they then dropped out from later things. But people had always obsessed about this without realizing what they meant, that they were actual markers or pauses, I think, about, you know, how it was meant to pause at certain moments. But Walker seems to be doing something very striking in a similar way, which is precisely, you know, what Jefferson was doing.
He is. And I would love smoking gun evidence. Walker is himself a meticulous footnoter, and he, in fact, footnotes the precise edition of Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia that he's citing and engaging in his argument. But it would be wonderful to know if he knew about precisely this in Jefferson's own treatment of the Declaration. I've argued elsewhere that his more immediate example for treating the Declaration in this way is the early anti-slavery printer Benjamin Lundy, who in the Genius of Universal Emancipation has a remarkably similar reprinting of precisely this line. This was the line that the abolitionists always invoked from the Declaration, right, for their anti-slavery arguments. And so it has the similar all caps and the same emphasis, however, missing that pointing printer's fist. And printer's fists are throughout Walker's appeal, but to note where he inserted additions to basically respond to his most hostile readers. But this is the only place where he uses one to highlight text that is not an addition, right? So this is what I call the typographical fireworks moment around the Declaration of Independence, so that he's just using all the tricks, so that he's basically rewriting it and it being respoken, right?
Yes.
Right. My question is about his title, Colored Citizens of the World.
Yeah.
And why did he use the term colored in a time when blacks were being called African a lot? Secondly, what does it mean by citizens in a country where blacks were not citizens?
Right.
And who was his audience when he said black citizens of the world? Who was he thinking about?
It's a really assertive statement by Walker of the right to citizenship, precisely because they're denied citizenship, right? But especially in directing it to the colored citizens of the world, it's of a global citizenship. And he frequently refers to people of African descent in the appeal as black, or we the blacks, he will say, but sometimes we'll also say the colored citizens. And he in the first, in the preamble, the first article, gives a global history of slavery, and he gives this global history of slavery precisely to arrive at the point that the form of racial slavery in the United States is the worst in the history of the world, right? And as part of this argument, he starts invoking other populations of what we would now call people of color throughout the world. And this is a point wonderfully that the writer William Apis runs with in his pamphlet that he publishes in response to Walker's appeal, inspired by Walker's appeal, does the math and says, basically, look, white supremacists, Americans and Europeans, you are vastly outnumbered by us. And basically, your time is coming, right, for where we're going to right this wrong by the ratio. And so both Walker and Apis, I think, have very clearly in mind, not just people of African descent in the United States, but what we would now think of as the African diaspora and other people of color in the world. And this is their most powerful biological argument against the biological racism being asserted at the time that was so influential. And then when you pair that, especially when Walker pairs that with the statement of equal rights for all men through the figure of Thomas Jefferson, who's written both, right, the Declaration and notes on the state of Virginia, that he is going to weave together both the racial dominance of people of color in the world, just mathematically by population, and then the right to citizenship, and assert their citizenship as again, something that's been unjustly denied, inhumanely denied, illegally denied. So it's a really bold political.
Let me rephrase it a little bit. Where does he get from color?
Oh, color. Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's something I don't actually know the answer to, and I hope that maybe someone here does. There's an interesting moment where he etymologically explains the N-word in the appeal, but he never explains why he, in his title and in the first, especially iterations of who he's addressing the book to, uses the word colored. And it's all, I've always found it very interesting that he spells it the British way, right? What he used still, when I believe I double checked, is that Webster at that time has taken the U out. So it's I believe by that point, Webster had taken the U out of colored, and Walker keeps it in. So this is a kind of archaicism. I've taken it as in Walker. Yeah.
I've been studying his very odd for anybody to use color.
In this way, yeah. And,
I mean, there's something that must have inspired him to use that term, because it wasn't a common use.
yeah.
By 1830, it became a term that was used in the colored national convention.
Right, precisely.
But when he published this in 1827,
It's early. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think this is another way that he's engaging with Jefferson's notes, and Jefferson particularly trying to, early in Query 14 in Notes on the State of Virginia, physically trying to locate where in the skin, in the layers of the skin, blackness resides, right?
and Jefferson doesn't use the word.
No, he doesn't at all, but he's also talking about Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, but talking about their skin color as well. And to my mind, this is a kind of translation by Walker of, again, color, like even though he's mostly talking about people of African descent in the appeal, he has a broader ideal, again, a very modern idea, I think, of people of
Is
color.
it possible that he recognizes that most people call black African, black or African, but they're really people of color?
That's an interesting question. But it's possible. I think he's, I mean, he largely accepts, in some ways, Jefferson's ideas of racial difference, of the difference, but not of the discrimination that Jefferson ties to that racial.
But he's in an era when very a small percentage of people, of Africans are black.
Yeah.
Some people are called that.
If we can move on, I
There
have
are
a
a
lot
lot
of other questions. So
There's
I-
a few from the
no,
chat,
go
actually.
ahead.
So Bonnie asked how instructions were conveyed to typesetters, headings, font size and style, etc., whether these might be visible on an original manuscript. And Jessica Linker asks, I wonder if you've ever thought about the font faces or stock used to print the appeal, which is largely New England type boundary stock with some odd exceptions. I've recently been struck by how elaborate the wrappers on the second and third editions are, how many faces they use, especially that trendy Italian font, and how fancy they seem compared to other pamphlets in wrappers that are being issued in the same year in Boston. Do any of the choices about faces have to do with Murray or Walker, or is it all the positive?
Oh, that's great. Yes, thank you to you both. Jessica, let's talk about that. So the $64,000 question for quite a while has been who were Walker's printers, and Peter Hinks had identified David Hooton and Matthew Pepperell, who were working class radical printers in Boston. They printed a radical printers newspaper there, and Walker had engaged them to print I don't remember if it was a speech or something for the Massachusetts General Colored Association. There was another use of color, Colored Association, in the year, I believe before, the same year that he printed the first edition of Walker's Appeal. So we think it was them. There's a pretty stark difference between especially the printer's fist in the second edition and the first and third editions of the appeal. To kind of link these two questions, we don't have Walker's manuscript. Oh, if we did, it would be wonderful. But if you very closely compare the three editions, you can see there are many just typesetting errors in the first edition. The second edition, it seems that whoever was setting the type decided to edit some of the punctuation and decided that Walker didn't need quite as many exclamation points or quite so much italics. And so it drops out, some of it does. And you can see it come back with a vengeance in the third edition. So I've always taken that, and I've argued for that's Walker going back to the printers or going possibly to different printers to say, I want this set exactly like this. That you cannot choose to not have 8 exclamation points. I need 8, right? And so that there's an unusual degree of control, I think, by Walker over the visual appearance of his text in the interest of voicing, very much like dynamic markings and music. And so that's the closest we can figure that out through the different editions because of not having a manuscript. The wrappers, Jessica, I'm very interested in this. They do seem to be more kind of showy in the sense of like how many different type of fonts that the printers had. But yes, it sounds like you've looked more into this than I have been, so I would love to hear more about that. We'll have to talk.
In the subsequent appropriations of the text,
Mhm.
by the figures you mentioned, do these typographic features, are these typographic features reproduced or are they leveled out?
In Garnett's 1848 reprinting of Walker's Appeal, which is the next time that it comes back into print after 1830, Walker's last edition, he keeps the typography. Interestingly, he uses the second edition, which must have been the one that he had on hand. But the other pamphleteers that are writing inspired by Walker, they're fairly typographically restrained. There's the moment where William Paul Quinn, the Methodist minister, has small caps and all caps and I believe 3 exclamation points, but that's about as excited as they get. The rest of them seem to have gone much more for argumentation and don't seem as interested in voicing, but also too, they're not as interested in circulation, that they don't seem to write.
There seems to be actually a tension and an acting against Walker's own intentions, where instead of putting a copyright page on, he says, I'm interested in the circulation of this. He's keenly interested in the physical appearance of the book and the typography. And yet when things go into circulation, those key elements of his text drop out.
That's right. Well, to speak about William Apis particularly, William Apis registered for copyright all of his publications, including the experiences of 5 Christian Indians, which is Indians Looking Glass for the White Man, which is a direct response to Walker's Appeal, appears in this pamphlet. The interesting thing about Apis that signals that he was concerned about publication or about circulation is that he wanted ownership of the text, but he puts this really fiery pro-equality argument for Native Americans in the back of what's a fairly traditional conversion narrative, set of conversion narratives, Methodist conversion narratives for 5 Native Americans, including himself. And so you get like what looks like a fairly traditional religious pamphlet that would have been circulating, in the millions at the time, with again a really fiery political track at the back. And so I argue that that's circulating under cover, right, of something that looks much more kind of politically innocuous, but at the same time he's registered and kind of controlled circulation, or at least ownership, by registering it for copyright. So a tension that we can see there.
More from.
Yeah, I think Sam has a question.
Okay.
Hi, Marcy. This is just absolutely terrific. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I have an anecdote and a question. So my anecdote is that, and maybe you already know this, so forgive me, but so there's this weird thing with Lindley Murray that I happen to know that when he dies, like he puts money aside for books to be printed and importantly stereotyped that are like promoting Christian values. And the reason why I happen to know this is that money from his estate was used to stereotype Abigail Mott's interesting biographical sketches and interesting anecdotes of persons of color. And I pulled it up on Happy Trust, and the very end of this advertisement that comes before the preface says, we now present to the public the following work with the belief that it is well calculated to promote the views designated by L. Murray, particularly among the colored population of our country. And that's the 1839 edition. So the book itself is published earlier, but the money to stereotype it comes from the Murray estate for the 1839 edition, so far as I can tell. So that's the anecdote, is that there's this weird way that Murray kind of comes back for Mott is a white woman, but the reason why I know about a little bit about this this collection is that it's used in the African Free School in New York. So that's just like a weird thing, anecdote wise. And then my question is, I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you. Like, do you have a sense of, was this happenstance or like just the popularity of Murray's grammar that it reaches Walker and kind of shapes it? Or is it possible that he's choosing among several models? I'm just sort of wondering, like, is it just Murray's grammar is so popular, he has access to it? Or is it like a strategic choice when there could have been other choices? So obviously, whatever speculation you have on that, I'd be interested to hear. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. We're going to talk more about the mock. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I didn't know that. And the African preschool is where Henry Highland Garnett was educated. And so we get circling back again, that connection. That's great. So yeah, it's my thought that I've been really trying to think about Walker and the intellectual traditions that he's getting funneled through specific sources. And so I've been really thinking about Murray and Jefferson. And so through Jefferson, I'm going to kind of answer or come at this backwards. He's getting the encyclopédie, right? The French encyclopedia movement because of Jefferson's debt to that and intellectual engagement with that kind of writing and that kind of intellectual comprehensiveness. And I think he's doing the same thing with Murray, and not just, again, what seems to me more important to Walker about Murray's grammar than the grammar. Grammar's good, not just for everyone else. He cares about grammar, but that he cares about the big mindedness that Murray is talking about in there, and that he quotes Hugh Blair, right? Hugh Blair, interestingly, also is responsible for the propagation of very racist ideas, the idea of that people of African descent can only parrot. And so there's that contradiction, but I think that, again, that big-mindedness that he's thinking of, the possibility for all human minds to be able to learn and learn equally, and thinking about the terrible political misunderstandings that come from what, again, Murray and Blair present as just simple miscommunication and misunderstanding, right? I think that is part of what he's trying to do with the typography in Walker's appeal, that he's trying to say, you misunderstood your own language, right? I mean, he literally says that, Americans, hear your own language. And so that if you hear it differently and understand it differently, then you act differently according to it. And I think, again, that's, and I do think it's Murray, because he refers to Murray's grammar several times specifically. He doesn't footnote it, but that's a specific reference because of its ubiquity and because of its acceptedness, I think, right? And he's very interested in what texts whites have taken as authoritative, right? And wants to, again, not just expand their application to people of African descent, but also in expanding their application to like he does with the Declaration and the Constitution, to kind of revise them, right? Reorient them, and modify them, adapt them, not just adopt them. And so, yeah, so I think all of that with Murray, like the Murray himself and what he's writing, who Murray is calling on, and then the bigger, really intellectual and epistemological ideas that are driving his writing.
I will, this is a great discussion. I don't want to totally detour it, but, and I feel like maybe you talked about this in your article, but I can't remember, so you can cut me up quickly. But the printed text also, and obviously the division into preamble and articles, makes me think of early printed editions of the Constitution. Or there were, if I'm right, these volumes that had the Constitution and the Declaration together. And that was in schoolrooms by this point, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. No, I
Does
don't.
he explicitly say, I mean, that, not chapters, articles, that's weird.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
For a book.
Yeah.
Or a pamphlet, a long pamphlet.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, I don't deal with it too much in the article, aside from just noting, like I did here, that this is a deliberate, invocation of the Constitution, and that he's much like he's doing with the Declaration, right? In invoking it, he's also rewriting it, right? Not just doing it on its own terms, but also, again,
It might be kind of cool to look at how he's really invoking it in the kind almost school book form that it might have been circulating.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, especially in texts that were pedagogical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and it's also, again, a wonderful tension that is citing the Constitution, which is a foundational document of the United States. The saying in its application to the United States is, if you will, a failed document. right? And yet, by the same gesture, he's extending it and elevating it to the status of documents that is pertinent not only to the United States, but to the world.
That's right.
To the colored citizens of the world.
That's right.
Which is of course how it's picked up, right? When it moves over to Canada, for example.
Yeah.
Question about the circulation of the Constitution is, I'm really struck by his replacement of copyright page with his statement. I want everybody to read this. I want to show that. How was the Constitution presented in printed editions at this time? And did it have a copyright page? Did it have text on the copyright page?
Jimmy Green is on the call.
Yes, where's Jimmy?
I don't know.
Paging Jim Green.
To me, it looks familiar, we don't have, it's like it's sort of the late 1790s, early 1800s versions that are small format,
Right.
that are kind of set up this way, and you can hard to grasp it, but I don't know
Yeah,
about that.
no, that's a,
Who owns the Constitution?
yeah. That's a good question.
Someone should have an answer.
I noticed a bunch of, I don't know.
Is
if it's
anybody in the chat?
relevant.
Well, there are some comments.
Okay.
But,
Hear me? This is Jim. Yes, it's very common. I mean, I think maybe even required legally to have a copyright statement in that position.
Right.
Regardless of what you're printing.
If you want to copyright it.
That's right.
But if you don't want copyright, it's not what-
Which I argue he deliberately did that. Yeah, that's right. No, in fact, in the book, I refer to it as a circulation notice instead of a copyright notice. And deliberately as such, right? That's right. Yeah.
And if anyone's got questions, because there's a lot of people out there, I've had more than a chance. I wasn't sure. Sorry?
there's one person.
Oh, there is. Oh, they should absolutely.
There, yeah. Hello, Derek. There you are.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Marcy, for this talk, and thanks in advance for the book. You've talked a bit about Walker building on things like the Constitution, the Declaration, Murray, and forecasting forward, but we also know that Walker was a subscription agent for Freedom's Journal. He's embedded in the Black Boston community. He cites folks like Richard Allen in the Appeal too. Can you talk a little bit about those print and intellectual traditions? I'm also thinking about, Benjamin Banneker, who famously writes back to Jefferson and draws on the Declaration.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much, Derek, and thank you for everything that you did to help bring this book into being too, all of our conversations, and for serving as a reader too. Yeah, I think that Alan's a fascinating figure to me because of, it's one of the most emotionally exuberant moments in the Appeal when Walker invokes Allen, right? He says, Richard Allen, oh my God, right? And it's this moment where he's just overwhelmed with gratitude for how much Allen has done for African Americans, both as a religious leader, but as a political activist too. And Allen's fascinating to me for, as you can probably pick up in this talk, I'm really starting to think I need to move back to the 18th century and become more of an 18th century, because I do see Walker is so indebted to the late 18th century. And Richard Allen is such a bridge figure from the late 18th century into the early 19th century, right? And because of, the pitfalls of periodization, we've not really seen that bridge as clearly as we could. And Richard Allen is a pivotal bridge figure in that moment, right? The early founding of the AME Church and his political activism before that. And so I see Allen as central in this intellectual tradition that's, again, coming from the late 18th century, but the religious wing, right? And so I really want to spend more time looking at early AME publications, because the AME Church publishes, unless I'm somehow horribly confused about this, but its own constitution, right? Yes, yeah, and so that they're also doing a rewriting of the Constitution, right, in constituting the AME Church. And so he's as much an interlocutor from the late 18th century as Jefferson, as Murray, right? And is, again, someone that he's not just, he's bringing in as a peer, but that is, again, in the ways that he's engaging with Alan, showing how Alan's doing the same kind of, not just adopting of these intellectual traditions, including Methodism and religious traditions, but also adapting them, right? Specifically for African Americans according to the experiences of racial discrimination and slavery. So yeah, you've once again anticipated me, and I can't wait to talk more about these things. Thank you.
Just add, when you read the narrative, they're doing typographical work and inserting ledgers, and I'd say framing Alan's influence as religious might miss a good deal of the political work that they're doing and the expansion on the discourse of the Enlightenment and the revolution. But yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you so much. And the chapter that I have dedicated to William Hall Quinn, who was a bishop in the AME Church, right? This is another thing that we've missed, that he writes again a fiery political pamphlet that seems to have been self-published, not published by the AME Church, but that we've missed precisely what you're pointing out, Derek, is that it's not just by any means a religious mission, but it's deeply politically engaged, right, and intellectually engaged, and yeah, so much more work to do there. Thanks again.
Do we have more questions in the chat? No, we don't. We seem to have a question.
I'm sorry. It was so productive and so interesting in many ways, Marcy. But what a sort of a larger question that struck me about the relationship between politics and grammar is that it seems to me a massively ongoing problem about how we think about politics, and that one direction that politics goes into is to related words like politeness, which are not unimportant in the sense that when you're thinking of politics and politeness and uniformity and common teaching, Gramsci was actually someone who was extremely concerned about creating uniformity, and he actually saw diversity of language as a strategy of repression, particularly in Italy, and that became a strategy of repression by the apartheid regime, is to actually prevent as much as possible a uniformity of language, for the reason that people then can't communicate with each other, quite literally, and they can't form alliances. But on the other hand, there's always been a sort of counter tradition that comes up theoretically through people like Christopher, revolution in poetic language, the notion that you need to actually shatter language. That's from a very elite position, but you've also got the history of graffiti, the history of subcultural languages, which point in a quite different direction. And it seems to me that something might be going on with Walker where he's doing both at once. That on the one hand, he's absolutely insisting on the importance of these foundational documents, which give access to statements like all men are equal.
Right.
At the same time, which is in a common language, at the same time, the way he's actually getting this printed seems very subcultural to me. It's literally, it's the sort of, it seems to be related more to graffiti and to all of those strategies, and also, frankly, to outrage too, to the strategies of outrage, which themselves, therefore, are sort of two motivating forces in politics, it seems to me, one of which is to unify and to try to find a level of uniformity, but at the same time to create breakages within a stifling uniformity.
Right. Yeah. I just a real quick thought about that he, so much of the appeal is also directed explicitly to white readers. I always think of these as like the old TV show Bernie Mac, like these Bernie Mac moments where Bernie Mac on TV used to say America and address the screen, right, break the fourth wall. Then Walker does this too. Instead of, he says, "You Christian Americans," right? And so, I've long thought and argued that it was exactly white readers who noticed most of the typography in the 19th century, right? And this is why it became such a sensational text in the South, as much for its arguments that it is no more for you to harm a man who is harming your wife and children as it is, than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty, as Walker said. But so these kind of, again, these appeals or these justifications of violence, but the typography, that they can see that this was going to be a sensational text that riled people up, just like that passage that I read from the newspaper, and that was what led to these bans. And so you're right, this even though he's speaking to very different, to a white audience with a specific message about, with often dire warnings that God is going to punish them for what they're doing, right? And he's largely, the typographically exuberant passages are mostly for voicing to Black readers, right? We can see this kind of back and forth where in that moment of reading and rewriting the Declaration, it's to both white and Black, right? So I agree, there's like a real kind of, it's working in both directions, both towards that unity and that diversity, that he recognizes he really wants to make good on these founding promises, right? And really realize them for once. But at the same time, realizes that the diversity that exists because of the difference in theory and practice, he's got to address that too. And so you can really just feel that tension throughout the text and see it.
Yeah, I mean, the headings of the articles are in the first person plural. It's not the Black man. It is our.
Yeah.
It's our righteousness is in consequence of and the listing. So that rhetorically is addressing not white readers.
That's right. That's right.
Readers.
Yeah.
I was just, this is more an observation because I got thinking, looking at typography. I mean, it reminds me a lot of like playbills and the ways in which typography gets used there.
Right.
And also in newspapers sometimes for advertisements, the ways in which typography gets used there, the kinds of extremes as they're trying to, draw attention to things. So it's just like, looking at these other pieces that seem to relate to that use kinds of use.
Yeah, no, it was one of my true pleasures while I was on fellowship at the library company when, as Philip Fancy was getting ready to retire, he just said, well, here's everything. And look at whatever you want, which was great, which was precisely what I needed to do, to take like as broad a survey as possible to see how, just what you pointed out, right? Like what else looked like this at the time? And mostly what people were saying at the time, in a truly kind of dismissive way, we're like, oh, that was just happening in advertisement. All he's doing is drawing on advertisement. But it's not. It's still different. It is much more closely related to dynamic markings in music. And really, truly, what I found in the survey of newspapers, at least in an American context, which is what Walker was looking at, was mostly American print, at least periodical print. It's post-Walker, and that's not me saying that Walker is responsible for typography in newspapers turning more exuberant in the 1830s and 40s, but really the only one before that is Benjamin Lundy that's doing quite that much. And then you get William Lloyd Garrison, and who's doing exactly the same things as Walker, but I would be directly influenced by Walker. So he is an outlier. He really is, especially in the ways that it's so clearly related to Wilson, I think. And so it certainly has echoes with, again, what's going on, like you said, playbills and advertising and things like that. But when you look at it really carefully, you'll see, and especially speak it, it's also its own thing. So.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying it was quick.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking about the ways in which typography is used in certain other places.
It's true. It's just, I joke that I switched geographies from working on early photography to typography because I was thinking about the relationship between words and images, right? And I thought, well, what about when words aren't images, right? That in this way, and this is something that we look past unless, on like a playbill or a broadside, something like this, right? That that's when it is working more imagistically, but to see it on a printed page in the pamphlet, right? That's it. Right.
Another place this comes up, not that Walker would have been influenced by this, but I think it points to the same tension, which is how do you express a voice, performance in print is in the printing of drama. And Claire Bourne's been working on this. There are a lot of 18th century experiments with, in editing Shakespeare and others with how do you typographically mark raising of voice or other aspects of performance. That's another domain, I think, where preaching too, clearly, there's a lot about how you mark up printed sermons for the same purpose, right? And it's not to say there's any influence necessarily, but to say that this is a structural problem with
That's right.
typography that, you can see addressed in these different domains. And to me, clearly Walker is thinking about performance.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's just so underscored when you see these other areas where typography is used in a related way.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, Zach. That Claire's work is really exciting to me. And so, yeah, no, I think, right, even if he's, like you said, not directly influenced by it, like it's certainly, there are other people working on precisely this problem and trying to figure out ways to address it too. And so it is interesting to think about like what's in the error, what's already been dealt with that he's familiar with, but like what is also truly kind of idiosyncratic about what he's doing, especially with a pretty heavy hand, right? So I think we can find ways to recover both. Yeah.
No more questions. I guess I would like to thank you with 8 exclamations. So thank you so much. And now we have show and tell for those.